what I'd like to do for a few minutes before we spend the rest of the time introducing Yeshayah, I want to make a little introduction to navi. I mean, to the purpose of Nevi'im. Obviously, it's Nevi'im Aharonim. So, and what is that function that the Navi has, right? So the Nevi'im, until now, was clear, has somewhat of a historical level, or inspiring the true Tshuva. But now Nevi'im, so the Gemara says, Gemara Masechet Megillah, Daf Yudal Amud Aleph, tells us that it says, הרבה נביאים עמדו להם לישראל כפליים כיוצאי מצרים. אלא נבואה שהוצרכה לדורות נכתבה, ושלא הוצרכה לא נכתבה. נבואה שהוצרכה לדורות. רש"י, נבואה שהוצרכה לדורות, what is this הוצרכה לדורות? ללמוד תשובה או הוראה. What is הוצרכה לדורות that we learn from this נביאים? ללמוד תשובה או הוראה. וכל הנח מ"ח, the 48, it's a long sugya, but 48, הוצרכו. Now, she just said something interesting. ללמוד תשובה, that's fine. או הוראה. What does that mean, או הוראה? So we're learning הוראה from the Nevi'im. So that's an interesting question in terms of how do we learn Hora'ah from Nevi'im. We already told us in navi Rashai L'Hadesh Davar Me'ata, right? We're not allowed to learn new dinim from the Nevi'im. So many Rishonim ask this question, but I'd like to quote some of the words of the Ramban. Ramban Nahmani, in his Hasagot Sefer brings that there are three types of limudim that we'll have in Nevi'im. One, as we know, as we see many times in the Gemara, the Gzerot of the Tachanot of the Nevi'im. For example, Rabbi the Melech Gazar al Yehud, or Moshe Tiken Lahem Israel Kriyat Sefer Torah. These usually are not mentioned in the Nevi'im, lo nechtevu. And there's some Gzerot and Takanot. These are obviously midrabanan. Then, he says, there are things that are nechtevu b'derech sipur. It's written, and the halachot that are brought down b'derech sipur, that are learned b'derech sipur, the mashal. We learned the halachot of tefillah from Hana. This is brought derech agar by sipur, the stories, and you find that somebody did something, and there were certain laws of tefillah that you learn from Hana, for example, or any sipur or any story. Ramban says these are d'Rabbanan. So far, there's no problem. Then he says you have some halachot shenichdevu derech sivui, right? Right. And this, for example, will be like the famous laws of Kohanim that are found in Yeshayahu and Rabbi, or things like that. Over there, the Deoraita. So what do we have to do with in navi Rashai L'Hadesh Me'ata? So he answers they're really halakha Moshe Sinai. They're not a hidush of the words of the Nevi'im. Rather, they are some form of halachot that were preserved b'al peh, and they were written at the beginning of the Nevi'im. So again, this is the function or purpose of the Nevi'im, according to Rashi, that it's not just as he says, teshubah, that's an important purpose, but also the lamed hora'ah. And where does the hora'ah come from? In that area. And you'll find that, by and large, most of that that it's not derech sipur is in the words of the Nabi. I don't know. Says it? Yeah, how do I? So you know? So, it should make it easy. That it's not derech sipur. That usually comes from Nevi'im, Aharonim, and many of the halachot that are learned from that derech sipur. Okay. So we want to introduce the book of Yeshayah. And there's a lot to talk about introducing the book of Yeshayah. First, a little bit about the time element in Yeshayah. Yeshayah operates, as we know, during the time of 4 kings. 4 kings, which are Uzziyahu, Yotam, Ahaz, Hizkiyahu. Now the question is when? When does he begin? Because we say Uzziyahu, but we know the first nevuah, which is in Perek Vav, is when? Bishnat Mot HaMelech Uzziyahu. So, what does that mean? So, when does he start? So, let's just run through one thing based on the, Sidra Olam. We find that Uzziyahu is king for about 52 years, Yotam 16, Ahaz 16, Hizkiyahu 29. So, if he is Bishnat Mot HaMelech Uzziyahu, so he's not really king in the time of Uzziyahu. Right? So, many of the Mefarshim say, right? Sidra Olam Mefurash, Rashi Mefurash, Radak, I'll read to you in that Hakdama in a minute. We'll read maybe a few lines from there. It says very clearly when he got Sarat. Right? And when he got Sarat would be after 27 years of his kingdom, so he still has almost half of his kingdom left. Right? And once he got Sarat, that is Bishnat Mot HaMelech Uzziyahu. And therefore, that's one approach. Some say, no, Bishnat Mot HaMelech Uzziyahu, Dak on the Perek brings, that's Mashmash when Uzziyahu died. Okay, now if you have Bishnat Mot HaMelech Uzziyahu when Uzziyahu died, so therefore you'd have to say that he began his Nebuah literally at the death of Uzziyahu. So what does it mean that during the time of Uzziyahu is it Kashir? Some want to say that in reality, although it seems that Perek Vav is the beginning of his Malchut, right? And it's the first nevuah because it says, Hineni shelachani, I'm ready, send me. Based on a pasuk in Divrei HaYamim, which it says, V'yeter Divrei Uzziyahu Rishonim Aharonim, Katav Yeshayah ben Amos HaNavi. Right? It's in the book that Yeshayah, was written by Yeshayah ben Amos HaNavi. So what's the Rishonim and the Aharonim? Some say that really Perek Vav is not the first one. Right? Rather Perek Vav somewhere comes in the middle. And that's not the first Perek, chronologically. And when he says it Miyashlah, it's because there were plenty of Nevi'im around. Right? There were plenty of Nevi'im around, including Yeshayah. Obviously, it's not working. Right? And so he says, we'll give the people a second chance. Right? Yeshayah is around the time of which other Nevi'im? Right? We know there's the famous 4. Hosea, Amos, and Micha. They're all around the same time. Yeshayah is reserved Nevuah specifically and only to Yehudah, although we have some references to where it seems to be Israel, like, for example, one that we just, you have to Zion today, right? So I think you may have just read it. Just read it. Let's see, right? The 65 years, remember that? Okay. So he says he's giving Yisrael 65 more years, right? So, Yehuda has only 65 more years? No, Yisrael has 65 more years. So, right, so that concept seems to be only relevant to the point of don't be afraid of them. As well, we have a few psukim where he calls on Shikorei Ephraim, right? The Mefarshim over there say that the rebuke there is of Ephraim is really for Yehuda that learned from Ephraim, and therefore it is really the rebuke of Yehuda that is learning from Ephraim. So again, you have these things, and like I said, he's as opposed, for example, to Hosea, who is minabeh for both. Yeshayah really specifically reserved. His nivuot are specifically reserved for Yehuda. Just a little word about some of those kings. Uzziyahu, we know, as we saw in Melachim, just a little bit of review. Uzziyahu becomes king at how old? 16 years old. He is considered a righteous king, Sadiq. Of course, he made that one sin which causes him sarat, which was what? Brought in Divrei Hayamim, that he goes in with the Ketoret. He's maqtir the Ketoret when he shouldn't have been. And that, of course, was a tremendous act of ga'ava, right? That he should not have done that. And he was a militarily strong king, right? He was marhev the gvulot of Yehuda all the way south until Elat, right? And this was, right, this was his military victories. He was considered a person who was Doresh Elokim. And in Divrei Hayamim, he's even further praised than he is in Melachim, minus, of course, that issue with that he was Mizabeach, he was Maqtir the Ketoret, and of course the problem still stayed with him in his time as Divamot. Yotam, very similar to his father. Some say, and it's unclear, some Mefarshim say, that his years of kingdom, really that 16 is not in addition to the father, but they overlap with Uzziyahu, because Uzziyahu was a Mitzorah, and he takes over at that point. But he is also Yeshar B'nei Hashem, and most of the Nibuot are in their time is Nehama. Of course, the first major Rasha that Yeshayah starts, we see, giving real Nivuah, that really rebukes him is of course, Ahaz, the famous Ahaz, right? And he was, of course, until now, one of the most evil kings of Yehuda, right? And he, of course, makes the famous alliance with whom? With Ashur, to protect him from whom? From Aram and Yisrael. And Yeshayah, that's the Nibu'ah you've already read, says, don't be afraid, don't worry, God's with you. And the Navi tells him, test God, and the king says, I'm not going to test God. And of course, the Mefarshim say that was no act of tzidkut. That's because he didn't want Shem Shamayim litkatesh al yado. That's really about Ahaz. And the bulk of his Nebu'ah that we see of Nehama is during, of course, the reign of Hizkiyahu. And of course, we've learned a lot about Hizkiyahu, and really the famous issue with Yeshayah is during the time of Hizkiyahu with the famous Matzor. I'll mention this a little bit later, but it's important to understand Yeshayah has, unlike Yirmiyah, very, very little narrative in it at all. The only time we have any story is really beginning from Yeshayah Lamed Vav to Lamed Tet, and that's a repeat of the story in Sefer Melachim, right? Yeshayah performs, with the exception of those 3 perakim, in which there are 3 miracles. We find no miracles performed by Yeshayah, not in Divrei Hayamim, not in Sefer Yeshayah, not in Melachim. What are the 3 miracles he does perform? The destruction of Sanheriv, the Refuah Hizkiyahu, and the famous movement of the shadow. That's it. And those are brought down in those narrative chapters, really from Lamed Vav to Lamed Tet. The only narrative we have of him is that same story in Divrei Hayamim and in Melachim, which is his interaction with Hizkiyahu. Otherwise, there's literally no unique story. Just there's no unique story we have of him. In terms of his family life, is also very unlike some of the other Nebi'im, right? The Nebi'im that we see, for example, Yirmiyah doesn't seem to have any family life whatsoever. Yehezkel definitely seems to have a wife, but we have bizarre, of course, the famous bizarre Nebuah Hineni lokeh mimcha et mahmad enecha. I'm going to kill your wife, and that happens. We have Hosea, of course, an interesting situation with the Zonah. With Yeshayah, it seems to be very, very regular, so to speak. We have mentioned of him 3 children, potentially 3 children. Who are they? Emmanuel, Shad Yeshuv, and one. Those are the 2, and one in tomorrow. You're going to read about him. Open it up. Let's see who'll catch his name in Perek Read about him tomorrow. He's got a very interesting name there. Anyone find it? Yeah. So now Emmanuel may be his son. Other Mefarshim say was the king's son, nevertheless. But we see he's got children. Nothing, he has children. He has, obviously, has a wife, and he also, according to the Mefarshim, is whom? His father is Amotz. Who is Amotz? The brother of Amaziah. So he's the brother of Amaziah. So he's the nephew of the king, which will, as we'll see a little bit later, he will have no problem entering into the highest places of Melucha, who walks in, has no problem with, going into, we'll see exactly, different places with the Sarim, the Ktinim, the Melech, right? I'll just show you, we'll just take a look at, the Melech we've seen. If you take a look at Perek Kaf Bet, Pasuk Tet, not Tet, actually, I'm sorry. It became no, that's what pasuk? Yes, I'm sorry. Give me an extra second. Right. So, okay, go to Kafhet Yud Dalid. Lachin shimu devar Hashem anshe lason mushleh ha'amazeh shel Yerushalayim. Many times you'll find him addressing the leaders. Of course, we saw in the beginning, Shim, right? Kitzinei Sdom, Amamora. He talks to the Kitzinim, he talks to the leaders without a problem. He's of the kingly courtier class. He has no problem addressing them, and he is, of course, on that level. With the question of the order, right? We know why Yeshayah is in this place. We know that the Gemara mentions, of course, a different order. That after Melachim we have Yirmiyah, then Yehezkel, then Yeshayah, right? Total non-chronological order. We get to Melachim. Then after that you'll have Yirmiyah because it's Puranut to Puranut. Then Yehezkel because it's a mixture of both, and then Yeshayah, which is total Nehama, right? and that thematic order. The Radak says something else interesting. He says, even still, we know that in Tanachim Hamduyakim, right? He says, we have the Mesorah of Hochma Eretz Israel, which seems to disagree with the Bavli, and the Radak says that seems to be the appropriate thing where we have it in chronological order. Abarbanel gives, we won't go through that, Abarbanel gives a very lengthy introduction to Yeshayah. In about half of that introduction, he spends the time giving 5 deep reasons why it has to be that way. It should be chronological. First, he says chronological is better. Then he talks about the superiority of Yeshayah vis-a-vis other Nevi'im. Qualitatively, he's a deeper Navi. He quotes Harambam in the Moreh. And then he talks about the importance of Nehama, its importance. So he basically gives, and he goes through, we won't go through it now, 5 reasons why the Navi doesn't follow Hazal. Right? He's Maksheh on Hazal. Is it true that Yeshayah is only Nehama? Is there not Puranut in the beginning? So, based on that, he seems to advocate for this version that Adak himself also advocated for, which is the which was the chronology, the chronological order. Okay, a lot of what I just said, I just want to read a few lines in the Adak here in front of you, just to illustrate some of what I just said, and then I want to go through a little bit more content-wise about some of the stuff in Yeshayah. Amar David bar Yosef ben Kimhei Asfaradi, 4 ספרים אלו, שהם ישעיה, ירמיה, יחזקאל, תרי עשר, הם נבואות ותוכחות ונחמות על ישראל. נבואות תוכחות. גם יש בהם נבואות על אומות העולם, על פורענותם. They're also unique that they have נבואה on about the פורענות. ולפי שהראו לישראל נכתבו בין הנבואות בכתבי הקודש. להודיע כי נקם מהם הקדוש ברוך הוא נקמות לישראל. What's the נבואות אומות העולם? To show that the נקמות for ישראל. וישעיה ניבא בימי 4 מלכים אלו. Now he says, גם הושע מצאנו שניבא ב4 מלכים אלו על יהודה וירושלים. Right, we also see that הושע did. ובהושע זכר ירבעם בן יואש מלך ישראל, לפי שנתנבא על חורבן בית יהוא ועל מלכות אפרים שתכלה. So the difference, as I mentioned beforehand, is that Hoshea was minabeh on the destruction of Yisrael, where although Yeshayahu did, that's clearly focused for Yehuda. Yeshayah lo nibeh el al Yehuda v'Shalayim, ואף על פי שאמרו בעוד 65 שנה יחת אפרים מעם, לא על נבואת יהוא בא אותו הפסוק, אלא להבטיח את יהודה שלא יפחדו עוד מאפרים. Don't worry about that. Okay. וכן מה שאמר וידוע העם כולו אפרים ויושב שומרון, בעבור יהודה אמר, כמו שאמר בסוף הפרשה, מנשה את אפרים ואפרים את מנשה יחדיו, המה על יהודה. It's clear that that was for יהודה. וכן מה שאמר, הו יתר את גאות שקורא אפרים. בעבור שזכר יהודה, שלמדו ממעשיהם. כמו שאמר, וגם אלה ביין שגו, שחרטאו. כל מקום, עיקר נבואתה הייתה ליהודה, ואמרו כי בשנה שנתנגע עוזיהו, מלך יהודה הייתה תחילת נבואת ישעיה. Right, it's interesting that he says this because he brings other perushim in the actual פרק ו'. כפי שאמר בשנת מות המלך עוזיהו, ואמר את מי אשלח, ואמר הנני שלחני. ואותה פרשה הייתה ראויה להיות תחילת הספר. אלא, says the Radak, why didn't that come first? שאין מוקדם ומאוחר בתורה. ואפשר, כי בתחילת מלכות עוזיהו הייתה תחילת נבואתו. Could be the very beginning. כי אמר בדברי הימים, ויתר דברי עוזיהו הראשונים והאחרונים הלא הם כתובים בספר אשר כתב ישעיה בן אמוץ הנביא. נראה כי גם בדבריו הראשונים נתנבא, אבל בשנת מות המלך עוזיהו, what happened? ראה מראה גדולה, he saw this great vision, שלא ראה כמו קודם לכן. It was a deeper vision than he ever saw beforehand. Right, the Gemara says, of course, there's a deeper vision even in Yehezkel, Perek Vav.
This is deeper than Yehezkel Perek Aleph or Perek Yod. This is a Yeshayah Ra'a Keben Krach, Yehezkel Keben Kfar. Yeshayah is a Ben Krach city. Hashub sees it more clear. Yehezkel Keben Kfar. Unclear, all sorts of different deep visions, right? Between Perek Aleph and Perek Yod. By Yeshayah, it's 3 psukim. It's very clear, concise. Right? כי אמר בדברי, אבל בשלב וזירה המראה הגדולה שלא רק כמו קודם לכן, לפיכך נבהל באותו המראה, ומה שאמר את מי ישלח, what is that, מי ישלח? נביאים אחרים היו בימיו, כי היה עמוס, והיה זכריה, המבין ביראת אלוהים, והיה הושע בן בארי, ואמר את מי ישלח, שידע להוכיח את העם, כי שלח את הנביאים ולא הועילו, I said many nביאים didn't work, ואמר לי שהנני שלחני, הנני עדיין שלחני. Yes, you could still send me. כי אם לא הועלתי עד עתה, אולי הועיל עדיין. Maybe I'll do. ואפשר לפרש פסוק בדברי הימים, כי דברי עוזיה הראשונים שהיו קודם נבואתו, כתבם בספר, עם אחרונים אחר שנתנבא. Things really, he wrote, chronicled Uzziah's things before his actual nevuah, but unlike what he just said, that he really didn't start till late. So you see here, a lot of points we mentioned here are in this Hakdama of the Radak, that there's this question of when he began his nevuah. The book is broken up into what's called usually 2 parts, right? But it's really more than that. But it's traditionally broken up from Aleph to Lamed Tet, which has a lot of different mixture of Tochecha and Nehama. Within there is still a breakdown. Between Aleph and Yud Bet, we find very often the background of Tochecha, Nehama, really Nehama, Tochecha, then Nehama again. Why? Because he rebukes, says, I'm going to destroy these people. And then he tells you, and then once I destroy them, the good people who are left are going to enjoy a lot of things. So it's like this mixture of Tochecha and Nehama, back and forth. From Yud Gimel on till about Vav Kaf Zayin, you have a bunch of Masa Nebuot. From Kaf Het to Lamed He, you have Hoy Nebuot, right? Lamed Vav to Lamed Tet, I already mentioned, that's the only narrative in the book about the story of the Masa and the Mapala of Sarhari. Starting from Perek Mem to about Nun He, you have total Nehama, where the Shiv'ah and Nehamata are from. From about the next 4 or 5 perakim, Nun He to Nun Tet, we have this conditional type of Nehama, do Teshuvah and you'll get it. And Samech to Samech Vav is more Acharita Yamin Nebuah. What is interesting is that Yeshayah pretty much throughout all of unique amongst Nevi'im HaHaronim basically follows, to the best of our knowledge, a chronological order. So, if Perek Vav is in the time of Uzziah, Perek Zayin is in the time of Ahaz, Perek Lamed Vav to Lamed Tet, for example, is the time of Hizkiah, Perek Mem Dalet Mem He is really in the time of Koresh. So, in other words, it's a pretty basic chronological order to the Nebuah. Now, I'd like a few minutes just to talk about some of the ideas that are mentioned in the book, right? Some of the basic content-wise ideas, and because we'll see some of the basic concepts here that Yeshayah talks about. Yeshayah, as we see, has some themes that penetrate the book. One of them, of course, a tremendous theme that you've already seen because it penetrates the beginning of the book a lot, is the romemut of Hashem and the shiflut of Adam. He talks about God is exalted, and man talks about himself that way, but it penetrates the book. And to him, he'll talk much about the sin of Ga'ava. The Ga'ava, especially of the leaders and the aristocracy, and he talks about the arrogant ladies and all of these people, because he's talking about the arrogance of that strong courtier class which he himself is a member of, and to him, the ga'ava of the leaders is a key component of the problem. Of course, that leads to something else that we'll see about a lot of the social ills in society that he's very concerned about. Of course, as you see, of course, the kiseh, the seraphim, the malachim ala, we have these seraphim all of a sudden who look and talk, who are mitaher the Adam, prepare the Adam for nevuah, and Rambam makes a big thing about that, right? That the malachim are the, so to speak, the intermediary, so to speak, to create nevuah between God and man, and of course it's that chapter of the seraphim that bring the nevuah back and forth. The concept of God sitting on a kiseh and like a king really is there, I think, to actually create the mashal of the navi, so to speak, as the shaliach. When God is sitting on as a king, and his entourage is around him, and hineni shilahani, the point there is clear, that the navi is the shaliach of Hashem. And that's an important component to this kiseh. We also find the Shekhinah on the kiseh, sitting on the kiseh, which is somewhat anthropomorphic. And the Gemara points out this what seems to be some gross anthropomorphism in the famous story of why Menashe killed Yeshayah. It's Menashe who actually accuses Yeshayah of being too anthropomorphic, and that Menashe says this was accused of being a kofar, and they deserve death. And of course, the Gemara puts in Yeshayah's mouth that Yeshayah had the answer. That there's a distinction between aspakla ha-me'ira and aspakla she'ena me'ira, but Yeshayah would not answer. What does that mean, aspakla me'ira, aspakla she'ena me'ira? Right, so based on Rambam, we find that, what is that? The aspakla ha-me'ira, even Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't zocheh, right? Had'eni na'at kevodecha. I want to know exactly why and how the way things work in clarity, and you can't. And Yeshayah was able to see him in what? See Hashem only ba'aspakla she'ena me'ira, which means what? Of course, only through the hamim, only through some limitation of our human understanding of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is about. Again, that's a little bit of how that Gemara understood in the eyes of Rambam, let's say, and others. But again, the Shekhinah is on the kiseh, right? And his cloak covers the whole hechal. But at the same point, he is milo kol haaretz kevodo. So Yeshayah has that concept of the nebuah, that he is in a mikdash, so to speak, in the hechal, but he's milo kol haaretz kevodo, that we shouldn't take that anthropomorphism too seriously. Yeshayah also deals with the very interesting concept of bihira versus hashgaha, right? Free will versus davar hashgaha. And where do we see that? We see that very clearly in the way Yeshayah deals with who? With Melech Ashur. Yes, Melech Ashur is my shaliach for what he is doing. I has brought him, and he will also get punished. So how does that work? Does he have bihira, or is the shaliach Hashem? So the way Yeshayah seems to solve that problem is, yes, he is my shaliach, but because of his lack of realization of that he is sent by God and doesn't realize it, he will be punished. And he is doing things, of course, further than he's supposed to do. Not supposed to attack you, that's not supposed to do that. So Yeshayah then says, and of course we see that he does get punished. That's how he was killed and the 108,000. We see Yeshayah in the beginning and at the end, right? In Perek Aleph, we of course have his most famous critique on Korban, but I don't need a whole Tanakh. I'm sorry, I don't have a Tanakh here. So his attack on, this is just the beginning part, his attack on Korban, right? Where he says, of course, the very famous pasuk, La mali rob tzivchem yomar Adonai savati olot elim v'chalev mera'im. He also, כי תבואו לראות פניי מי ביקש זאת בידכם, חודשכם ומועדכם שנאה נפשי, right? Doesn't like that. And the end of the book. כה אמר אדוני השמיים כיסי וארץ אדום רגלי, איזה בית אשר תבנו לי ואיזה מקום מנוחתי. ואת כל אלה ידי עשיתי ביו כל אלה נאום השם ולאיזה אביט אדוני נלכי רוח בחרד על דברי. שוחט השור, מכה איש, זובח עשה, עורף כלב, מעלה מנחת דם חזיר, מזכיר לבונם אברך אבן, גם הנה בחרו בתרכם שוקסם נפשי חפץ. So in other words, his critique from the beginning of the book towards the end of the book seems to be his critique of Mikdash, his critique of... But it's unique because, of course, he is the one who brings his mashal in Hechal Hashem and in Mikdash. So one must say about that of course he is not specifically against Korban, but rather against what would be considered the magical protection of Korban. We have the famous Nebu'ah that he, which became a Hebrew saying, right, in... ויאמר אדוני in כ"ט י"ג יען כי ניגש העם הזה בפיו ובשפתיו כי ביטוני וליבו ריחק ממני. Right? They speak one thing, but their heart's somewhere else. ותהי יראתם אותי מצוות אנשים מלומדה. Right? It's a rote. So he criticizes again the worship that has no heart in it. Throughout all his Nebu'ah, of course, he attacks social injustice. This is something that Yeshayah, most more than anyone, attacks. You see it in Perek Aleph, you see it in Perek Bet, you'll see it throughout, that he seeks for Mishpat Tzedek, right? And that it even connects, of course, to Avodah Zarah. His critique of Avodah Zarah is a critique of Avodah Zarah, but it's also a critique of Avodah Zarah that leads to some of the Avodah Zarah itself, leads to a lot of these social ills as well. So while Avodah Zarah itself is a sin, right? That is bad, right? Itself, obviously, but itself is also bad because it leads, and that's the context in Perek Bet, right, where בית יעקב לכו ונלכה באור השם, כי דתשת עמך בית יעקב, כי מלאו מקדם, ואוננים כפלישתים, ובילדי נוכרים הספיקו. ותמלא ארצו כסף וזהב, ואין קץ ארצותיו, ותמלא ארצו סוסים, ואין קץ מרכבותיו. Right, you see that. We already have seen, and we've mentioned, politically, Yeshayahu was against all political alliances. Right? He rebuked Ahaz for his alliance with Ashur, but at the same time he was willing to rebuke Hizkiah for his alliance with Babel, potentially against Ashur. And again, very famously, Yeshayah is all about Aharit HaYamim, Umot HaOlam, and again, the very famous Isaiah wall, peace with Umot HaOlam, right? So there is this vision of peace. Okay, I'd like to speak for a few minutes on this, and then if I have time after, I'll just go into some of the Nebuot and Perek Vav. But I want to speak now about the idea of Yeshayah as a book. So it's been, it's quite a famous theory that Yeshayah Aleph and Yeshayah Bet, right? That Yeshayah, for the first 39 perakim, is one, and that already fits with the time of the latest part of Yeshayah could be is Hizkiah, and Hizkiah is approximately a little bit less, but let's say if you do the dates, Hizkiah starts ruling, if you say in his 6th year is 722. So it's 716, and about 29 years to that, and you then really have 716 minus 29. No, I'm sorry, 722. 722 is Galut Israel. That's in the 6th year, so 728. So around his Hizkiah approximately ends his life at around 700 BCE, a little bit later, 698, BCE, and it's clearly at least he dies. Yeshayah's last nebuah is way over 100 years before the Horban, and all of a sudden in perakim we see what's happening. We see that he's minabeh at Koresh. We talk about the nebuah nehama after the Horban, right? At the Siyum, Rabbi Avi Harari made a point on this idea. He mentioned it a little bit, and his position was that it's really one book, and it's purposely there to confuse the people for the to accommodate his nebuah of right Hashmein Lev Ha'am Hazeh. But again, some say no, it's two, and Hazal seem to say it's one nebuah, and that's why they call it Nehama. But some say no, there's two Yeshayahs, that's Yeshayah Aleph, and then there's Yeshayah Bet from perakim and on, and it's a different guy, and maybe his name is not even Yeshayah, it might be some other navi, and his works are appended. And this was a famous approach of generally secular scholars. Then some people, a little bit more of the traditional came to say, you know what, you can adapt such a thing. And by the way, they became all sorts of variations of this theory. Some say it's not only from perakim, but there's even things from the earlier perakim that really belong to Yeshayah Bet. Some say no, there's other nibuot from later that really belong to Yeshayah Aleph. And some say there's even 3 or 4 Yeshayahs. Yeshayah Gimel, Yeshayah Dalet, and then they start to chop it up the book. Yes. And again, some even people, they say, you know what, religiously it's not a problem. And they point to some precedent in, for example, who wrote Sefer Shemuel, right? Shemuel wrote his book, but did he really write the whole book? He dies before it's over, right? So obviously he couldn't have written everything because Shemuel is dead. So he doesn't live all the way. He dies before Shaul dies. So obviously later they say Gad HaNavi completed it, so we can split a book in half and have 2 authors. We have a famous midrash that there are 2 psukim in Yeshayah that really Yeshayah didn't write. They're the nebuah of the father of Hosea. 2 psukim. So we see, you could say so from 2 psukim we went to 22 perakim, 27 perakim. But this is the opinion. The first scholar, so to speak, academic person who just attacks this, so you see it's pretty old, Shadal already hears and has heard this theory. And Shadal, who is by and large not always the most traditional of commentaries, claims that this, he attacks it and calls it almost kfirah. Shadal. And he says the people that do this, their agenda is to be makhish the nebu'ah. What's the big deal? A navi is prophesying something that didn't happen yet? That's such a hadush. If you believe in nebu'ah, the Shadal says there should be no hadush here. So Shadal was one of the first who says, this is impossible. And it should be no surprise that a navi can prophesy for later times, and in fact, prophesies it as if it happened. Because the navi experiencing nebu'ah, says Shadal, lives in that olam. Very much, as we say, in defense of Harambam, for example, in the nebu'ot of Vayera, right, that Harambam says it's all nebu'ot, and you see Abraham Avinu is going and cooking food and telling people to cook food. What are you doing? There's no one there. It's a vision. So, some Mefarshim say to defend Harambam from the Ramban, that doesn't literally mean that he was cooking, that he saw himself cooking in a vision. That it could be very possible that he actually did cook, he lived in that real experience. So Shadal says it's very possible that he saw it and lived it as if it was happening, as he's experiencing that nebuah. Now, the question would be, why would God give him such a nebuah? So we can have multiple theories. by Rabbi, we could have others, we'll see. But the essence of the navi saying something that didn't happen is not something that should shock us, says Shadal. And Shadal really would prefer to say that he may have wrote it down, preserved it, and may not have even actually said it to the people. It just was written down. The Dat Mikra, and in Yeshayah, you see in Dat Mikra, the different books are written by different authors, right? And there's a whole host of people. Whenever you get, so you have to know who you're reading, but look, who am I to say? But by far the most enjoyable, clearest, and the most really the best mefaresh, who when you get a chance to get the book by him, you really, and it's most traditional as well, but really has the greatest clarity, is Amos Hacham. Amos Hacham, he was a Temani, right? And he just digress for a moment about Amos Hacham, because Hayim Tawil told us the story, knew him very well. And he says, when Amos Hacham came to Israel, Teman, and they had all these, he came from Teman, he was a short Temani guy, he's coming, and all of the biblical scholars, and he entered into one of these contests, and they couldn't believe it. He's just beating everybody from all these universities, and his awareness and knowledge of Tanakh, and quoting the Psukim, and state of affairs that they, in the beginning, in the first, they ensured that he would not win the specific prize, right? But eventually, it didn't matter, because he was by far one of the top scholars of Tanakh at that time. And so whenever you get a chance, I think Iyov is by Amos Hacham, in Yeshayah is by Amos Hacham. You'll see that there's such a difference. You'll see it so clearly such a difference when he's writing it. It's really those books that he is authoring their perush are. It's a treat to read those ones. So here, as you're reading Yeshayah, well, I didn't always recommend the early ones. I would definitely recommend using the Dat Mikra as well. So he also takes up this issue, right? And he questions. He says, "Listen, he brings the Sefer Ikarim that says the purpose of the navi is not to tell the future, but to exhort people to do tshuva." So he questions, okay, of course it's possible that the navi would say something that didn't happen yet, but the question is, why is it necessary about the generation at the latest of Hizkiah to hear about Koresh? What's the point, right? And to hear about this Horban. So he takes it interesting. He takes Shadal, and he says something interesting, because we know that Yeshayah, some like other Nevi'im, but is he has what he calls limudav, and many of the Mefarshim of the Talmidim, that Yeshayah seems to have a group of Navi students. And so Hacham says that this Megillah that he wrote was preserved to give to his students to be read necessarily for later generations. He may not have read it, Hacham says, to that generation. It would preserved. Now, he goes further to say, based on the Gemara in Baba Batra, right, that talks about who authored which book. And so who authors the book of Yeshayah? So it says, not Yeshayah himself. It says, Hizkiah v'siato. Now, it's difficult, because based on the Gemara itself, Yeshayah dies after Hizkiah, right? Who kills Yeshayah in the Gemara? Menashe. So what does that mean? That Hizkiah wrote the book. That doesn't solve your chronology problem. If anything, you're getting someone who died earlier to write the book. Doesn't make sense. So his concept of Hizkiah v'siyato means not just Hizkiah, but Kol Talmidei Yeshayah, of which Hizkiah himself is a member of. Right? Hizkiah is always asking Yeshayah for advice, and he's asking for him to pray for him, and it's almost like this fatherly figure. So Hizkiah v'siyato are members of the limudav, of the Talmidei Yeshayah. And he says, based on Rashi, on that who is Hizkiah v'siyato? Bnei doro she'erichu yamim aharav. So that can't just be Hizkiah. She'erichu yamim aharav means they lived after him. So if they lived after him, who must that be? It must be lists of Talmidim. So Hacham wants to say that this group of Hizkiah v'siyato, there might be a group of people that may have lived, and Talmidav that lived after. And when they compiled the book, they compiled Nibu'ot that were said to the people at that time. And there were Nibu'ot, like Shadal said, that might have been preserved in writing. And Amos Hacham adds to the point that they were preserved in writing for generations. And when the book was published is when the time that it might have been appropriate to hear it. And so therefore, it was written and compiled. It could have been generations later, all based on the Nibu'ot of Yeshayah, based on the Talmidim of Hizkiah v'siyato. And therefore, why would the Gemara say Hizkiah v'siyato? Because she said, She'erichu yamim. They were ma'arich yamim. And it could have been more than one generation. Arichut yamim of Talmidim, that compilation could have lasted more than 100 years. Right? Today we see some books that published, written, even according to Hazal, years later. So therefore, and that's why the Gemara would turn and say Hizkiah v'siyato. If it was just Hizkiah, like I said before, it would make no sense. Why would the Gemara make somebody earlier than Yeshayah writing the book? It wouldn't make any sense. So Hizkiah v'siyato could be Talmidim, and we do see that Yeshayah is a navi that has Talmidim, and therefore it shouldn't surprise us that it's written later for a Nibu'ot that makes sense to a generation later. These Nibu'ot, as Shadal said, were not said at that time. They were said later. And again, that should not surprise us. Okay, so that's an introduction to Yeshayah. What I'd like to do in about the 4 to 5 minutes that I have left is just enter into some few psukim in Yeshayah, and we'll take off on Yeshayah Vav. And like we said, Yeshayah Vav has some interesting parts in it. One, that Yeshayah alone among the Nebi'im is excited about the job. Right? He's amongst the Nebi'im. We don't find anybody else, or very rare to find a Navi who really wants this job. Right? We know, of course, Moshe doesn't want the job. It doesn't seem that it's clear that Yirmiyah doesn't want the job. Yehezkel sort of force-fed the job. It's hard to find Nevi'im like Yeshayah who jump and say, here I am, send me. Who should we send? Volunteering, right? Yeshayah is someone enthusiastic about this opportunity. It's very possible, Yeshayah being who he is and of the importance of who he is, I mean, he's the cousin of the king, it's very possible that he doesn't feel he has what to fear like the other people who come from a different level of class of people, right? It's ironic that if that's the case, that Yeshayah is the only Navi that we know that is killed by the king, right? His own, and if you take Hazal, he's killed by his own grandson, right? It would make sense, right? Banim gidalti v'romamti mamash v'im pashubi, right? That his grandson actually killed him, right? And it's because he gives his daughter to marry Hizkiah, and Hizkiah has Menashe, and Hizkiah didn't even want to get married according to Hazal, right? He didn't want to have this kid, and it was Yeshayah who forced him to have this kid, and again it's Menashe who killed him. So, but again, Yeshayah is volunteering for the job. And as that, God gives him, more than anybody, the warning, right? And the warning is, this isn't going to be easy. And he tells them, tell the people, strange psukim, Shim'u shamoa ve'al tavinu, uru ra'o ve'al tedau. So what is he telling the people to? So there's different perushim that will suggest. Shim'u shamoa ve'al tavinu, right? The pshat. He tells them, you're going to hear and not understand. You're going to see and you're not going to know. Meaning, because, and the next pasuk is Hashmin lev amazeh. Many Mefarshim say it's not a command to Yeshayah. Some say it is. The Radak says it is, but some say no, that their lev is fattened, and this is a reason why al tavinu, they're not going to hear you. So, in other words, Yeshayah, you want this job. I want you to know that this is not an easy job. Others say something interesting. That what is Shim'u Shamoa ve'al tavinu? Shim'u Shamoa, meaning Yeshayah tell the people, listen. Don't ask questions. Just listen. Shim'u Shamoa ve'al tavinu. Just follow. No she'elot, no hakirot, no attempt to understand on your own. Because you're too far gone. Ura ra'o ve'al tedau. Just listen. Just listen and hear. See and hear. Don't attempt to understand and analyze. And of course, the next pasuk, Hashmin lev ha'am hazeh ve'oznav achbed ve'enav hasha pen yir'eh be'enav u'be'oznav yishma u'lavo yavin v'shav ve'rafad. So, some would say that this is the state of the people. And some would say, as probably most would say, that, I think, by the way, it's the Malbim who says that it's the state of the people. This is not what the Navi had to do. But others would say, no. It is the job of the Navi, the Hashmin et leva'am. Right? And what does that mean? Is it literally mean to make them stupid? To make them confused? Well, some say yes. Yeah, because they are lost in the ability to do tshuva, and that's it. Lead them astray, so to speak. It's a little difficult, because is that the job of a Navi? And does Yeshayah really do that? Rather, it would be to say that he would go to tell them, right? Hashmin lev amazeh, meaning to talk to them about their lev shemin. Meaning to remind them that their lev is shemin. So when I say I make your heart fat, I'm not literally making your heart fat. I am telling you, I am categorizing you as a fat-hearted person. Because I am there to tell you, you're gone. You're lost. My words are not coming into you. Right? And it's almost a sarcasm. Right? It's like, right. In other words, your ears are your hard of hearing, so to speak. This is all what you are about. Right? And your eyes are covered. In other words, to tell them what, so to speak, that they are not going to be able to hear it. And they are not going to be able to listen. It's like a person would talk to his friend and says, I would tell you something, but I know you're not going to listen to me. No, tell me. No, I know you're not going to listen to me. I know. By the way, who really does that? Who at the end of his life? Of course, he and me, yeah. Right, he says, listen, I'm not going to, please don't ask me. I'm not going to ask God because you're not going to listen. No, we're going to listen. No, you're not going to listen. I'm not going to ask God. No, please don't. Okay, I'll ask him. And of course, he asks him and they don't listen. They go to his side. But in other words, that concept of that the people's hearts are fattened and Yeshayah is there. Hashmin lev ha'am hazeh. And of course, he answers, right, until when? And he gets this famous Nebuah of the Assyria at the end. And of course, the Assyria, according to Mefarshim, is what? There were 10 kings left until Tzidkiah. If you count, there was actually, right, 10 kings from Yotam, right? Not including Uzziah. You have the 10 kings all the way that wind up in Tzidkiah that would lead until the destruction. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.